Jim Crow was legal. The Sackett and Vanzetti was legal. The Holocaust was legal under the Nazi laws and so forth. So I'm not suggesting that as a lawyer, I'd like lawlessness, but you recognize at the various times that there were things written into the law that we see as, retrospectively terrible.
It does seem that we're at a very unstable time. I remember years ago when we worked for Open Society Foundations and everybody said everything was going to pieces. It's like compared to now, it's like, do you feel like there's been a rise of anti-Semitism in this time?
It's interesting when you look at anti-Semitism historically. I think certainly we've seen more instances of it in the last few years, and certainly since October 7th. Not that it's ever disappeared. On the other hand, there are things that are good. At least in the prior administration, when there were things that were happening, they had meetings at the White House, they had a national strategy, they spoke out. If you look at the issues in the Jewish community back at around the year 2000, what was the issue? It was intermarriage. Jews are being loved to death. So that's still part of the challenge, or the opportunity. But on the other side, there's certainly been an uptick in hate crimes. We've always seen, especially since the Second Intifada, an uptick in hate crimes against Jews when there's a lot of violence and shooting involving Israel and the Middle East. And the difference this time is that it's continuing. It's not just for a week or two. We can get into it more, but the thing that worries me more is the things that we see in society that push people into anti-Semitic modes of thinking. And it doesn't have to be about Jews. Some of the debate is about whether a certain phrase or a certain attitude is an anti-Semitic one or not. When what's driving people into anti-Semitic ways of understanding the world is to sort of divide the world into who's us, who's them, seeing to them as the threat, whether it's immigrants or transgender folks or Muslims or whatever, and then trying to figure out, okay, how do I handle that they are a threat to us and getting a better, shake than they deserve. And going to the idea that there's a group behind the scenes somehow making this happen because it otherwise wouldn't happen is historically a vehicle for anti-Semitism. And that's what concerns me at the moment more than anything else.
If you take a character like Viktor Orban, you can understand why he needs something to rail against. Jews or George Soros can occupy that place. I'm not sure, being that he was a Soros scholar and started as a Soros scholar, I don't think George could go visit there at the moment, but like I understand it in that sense. I'm not that I understand it, but I can recognize it in that sense. What I don't really have a good feeling about is just why do people need to hate? Like, why is that a necessary position to take?
Yeah, two questions there. So let me deal with the Soros thing first, then the larger question. Politics is such that hate works, right? And for Soros, anti-Semitism worked. You had the pictures of Soros as the smiling Jew and all that. Didn't surprise me that he did that, given the sort of history. What's sort of disconcerting is that you had then people like Israeli Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu saying good things about Orban, overlooking his anti-Semitism because he sees Orban as a friend of Israel. And that's one of the challenges about anti-Semitism, is that people both on the right and the left tend to discount anti-Semitism when it comes from people in their political camp about Israel. And that's one of the conundrums of anti-Semitism and how it works politically. In the larger question that you're asking, yeah, I think that we're all human beings. Our brains were formed millennia ago when there were groups on the other side of the hill that we didn't know who they were, and they were potentially a danger to us. And I can go into the evolutionary psychology and the social psychology and the brain science and so forth. But the bottom line of it is, as animals, as human beings, we're sort of primed to make quick decisions on who's us and who's them and what threats are there. And when we have our identity, our sense of self tethered to, especially an idea of social justice or injustice, as we see on Israel-Palestine, or you could see about other issues, abortion, many others, what happens is that we crave a bunch of things. We crave simplicity. We crave certainty. We are attracted to sort of binary thinking that all justice is on our side and all injustice is on the other side. And that helps us form a sense of community, and it sets some moral parameters for how we look at the world. We don't see it as hate, we see it as love of self. And I think those things are pretty natural in terms of how human beings have navigated throughout history. We've always had hate regardless of when or where, what political system, economic system. any other variable you want to slice and dice. And sometimes it's, manageable. Boston Red Sox fans hating New York Yankee fans is, with the exception of drunk people occasionally, it's not going to really cause any harm. But we could point to lots of instances in history where it is incredibly harmful, where we don't see ourselves as human beings first. We tend to be attracted to this sort of tribal nature of who we are.
Do you ever have a definition of hate?
We have a definition of hate studies that looks at the human capacity to define and then demonize or dehumanize another, and the processes that can curtail, control, or combat that capacity. So, what's good about that formulation is that it looks at hate in two different ways. There's sort of one that you think of normally, right? The visceral, I hate you type of hatred, but also that it encompasses things where people just say this is how the world works, like slavery. I don't know that slave owners necessarily got, angry about what they were doing, but they just saw this as, what the religion teaches, what's right, what's historical. It's always been this way, but it's still hateful. It's demonizing and dehumanizing. So that those are the things that we study in the growing field of hate studies, but it's a recognition that hate is a bunch of different things, right? It's partly emotion, it's partly behavior, it's partly things that come from religion and ideology. And if you mine into each of those things narrowly, to silo into each of them separately, you see even more complexity when you look in the brain science about it and what parts of the brain fire differently when somebody hates. I mean, there's just beginning to do things with experiments of people at MRIs for the last 20 years or so, but it's associated with other emotions, anger, disgust, fear. So there isn't like one specific spot in the brain you could say this is the hate center, at least as far as we know. But we can study the fact that human beings do make quick decisions about who's us and them and who to fear, and we get all these other messages about how to look at the world. So hate is a complicated phenomenon. Part of what we're trying to do with hate studies is not only recognize that, but say, look, how do we as a society deal with other complicated challenges? So people get sick. We have a field of medicine. What does it do? It pulls from biology and chemistry and other fields, physics, to basically give us answers to how people get sick and what we can do about it. What we're trying to do is there's a great amount of knowledge in all these different fields, social psychology, religion, anthropology, and so forth, but we're trying to pull it together in a way so that we're looking at hate holistically, how it plays in the real world to give us better answers.
Yeah, that's incredible. So then the teaching of hate is it something that's taught versus innate? And I love this notion of looking at the MRIs, like what's flooding. Is it a dopamine thing that gives you energy? Right. So there's so much. It's fascinating. I mean, it's upsetting, but it's really important work. Really important.
I was reading about Justice Henry Brown, and he said the law is not what we want it to be. The law is what's written, talking about the Constitution justifying slavery. And that just seems like justification. Did he believe it? What is that? He's giving away the humanity of a soul to talk about why we should keep holding them in bondage. What is the root of that?
Well, that's a great question. And at the time, that's what people thought, right? And when I teach about legality, because I'm a lawyer, there's a clip from this wonderful film that Emily and Sarah Kunstler made about their father, Bill Kunstler, who was one of the preeminent lawyers in the civil rights struggle. And he talks about what's legal. And he made the point, look, Jim Crow was legal. The Sackett and Vanzetti was legal. The Holocaust was legal under the Nazi laws and so forth. So I'm not suggesting that as a lawyer, I'd like lawlessness, but you recognize at the various times that there were things written into the law that we see as retrospectively terrible. The question is, how do we manage that and look at that period of time? And I've seen some attempts to say, wait a minute, this is so awful, we can't look at it. I was at one school where I was teaching about academic freedom, giving a talk about hate and anti-Semitism and so forth. And I remember a conversation with the general counsel of a law school who said that there was some pushback from some law professors that basically said, we can't teach Dred Scott. We can't teach Plessy versus Ferguson because people would find it triggering. And she obviously said, no, you got to teach that. And the point is that there's an ugly part of history. And if we ignore it, we don't understand, we don't learn from it. So I agree with you that those things are horrible, but it's an opportunity to look back at what period of time, how people looked at things, and how we look at things in our own time.
Alistair McIntyre talks about moral relativism in this sort of framework, the idea of how do we judge past societies or even other countries? How would we do that? And it seems to me that he's getting at, are there eternal truths at the root of law? Was Solomon's law the same as our law? Is that where we should be thinking about today? Or does relativism sort of take us out of that framework?
Well, I think it's important to have a holistic view of law, both historically in terms of what it's doing at the moment and so forth. And one of the things that I think that is undervalued when we look at law so narrowly, though, because I've seen it play out in some of the contemporary debates about anti-Semitism and about other things too, is we tend to look to law to be the magic solution to all societal problems. And what happens when we do that is that we miss so many other things that could actually be more effective. I mean, one of the debates that I've been involved with for years now, and it's going to heat up again soon, is about the using of a definition of anti-Semitism, for which I was the lead drafter for a different purpose back, 20 years ago, to have the government and other parts of society look at what is anti-Semitism and what isn't, particularly on the college campuses. Harvard just adopted the definition. I understand why people feel, oh, this is, a symbol, because symbols are important when we hate too, or when we fight hate. This is important. It's a battle against anti-Semitism. People are taking a stand, but not really looking at what this does. When you put things in a legal framework, it's going to chill speech. It's going to encourage people to use a legal tool. It's going to not think about what to me is a much more important thing on a college campus. I mean, how do you teach about this? How do you get people to have discussions about divisive issues in a productive way? How can you impart more knowledge and get students to really engage these issues in a way that taps into their intellectual curiosity, taps into the idea of emotional empathy for people that might have a totally different view than you? All that falls by the wayside when you think about how law works. And I'm not saying law doesn't have a place, it does. But I think we overemphasize the use of law in thinking about hate.
What is law? Because ultimately it's things your grandparents told you, it's things you learned around the dinner table, and then it's codified at some point. But what is at the root of the law?
What is at the root of the law?
Yeah.
Law is a way of regulating society, right? It's a way of thinking about what the norms are, what's in bounds, what's out of bounds, a reflection of societal values in many ways. And one of my favorite books, I remember reading this, decades ago, was Homage to Catalonia by George Orwell, who was describing what happened in Barcelona and Catalonia when the anarchists took over and they had to control things. So what do anarchists do when they have to put things into law? The idea that there was no property, so you couldn't have a theft of a bicycle. It was communal property and so forth. It reflects the societal values and so forth. But again, people are fighting political battles and want to use law in ways that I think, particularly at the moment, we're seeing are destructive of democratic norms. And that's what troubles me, just aside from just being a citizen. It troubles me in thinking about how we combat hate, because one of the things that I think is really critical to combat hate, if you look historically, at least over the last couple of centuries, is when you've had the capacity to fight hate well, it requires strong democratic institutions. Strong democratic institutions make it possible. So when you have attacks on the free press, on judiciary, on what's being taught in school in a way with a political agenda, when you have encouraging people to turn other people in because of their immigration status or because of other things, that makes combating hate more difficult. And I don't like seeing law used that way.
So, do you see what's happening right now then, and as a direct erosion of these institutions? We are Department of Education is going away. The judiciary is in question now. People don't really understand what's happening. I mean, are these intentional? And where do we go in the worst case scenario? What would happen then if all of these supporting institutions, for what Jesse was asking, shutter?
Well, I don't know that they'll shutter. There's certainly more. The Department of Education, I mean, who knows what's actually gonna play out, and there were things in Project 2025. I can't say I read the whole thing. I read parts of it. There are things in Project Esther about anti-Semitism. But if the Department of Education, which was my understanding, established by Congress, you can't just get rid of it, willy-nilly. But there are aspects of it that I think will get morphed into other agencies. So one of the things that I've seen talked about, and who knows how this will play out, is that a lot of the Title VI enforcement may go over to the Department of Justice, and there's some indications of that. Now, on the downside of that, that's pretty scary when you're having the, Justice Department as opposed to the educational department going after what students are saying or happening on a campus. On the other side of it, the way that it works now under the Department of Education is that anybody can bring a complaint for Title VI. It doesn't mean that it's going to get sustained, but it means that they have an obligation to look at it if it seems credible. I brought one for Jewish high school students outside of Binghamton, New York, where there was a Kick a Jew Day. And so that was a great tool. You can go and say, okay, look into this because the school isn't dealing with it well. If you put in the Department of Justice, complaints come not from the public, they come from the Department of Justice. So how that's going to play out, I don't know. But I worry about what we've been seeing across the country that may be a model for this. And one of the things that I see as a model education-wise is Florida, where Governor DeSantis was very clear in terms of his agenda. So what he did is he adopted this International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, the definition of anti-Semitism, and then required that schools, colleges, look at courses that are being taught about Israel, Palestine. There was keyword search to review the courses. And that struck me as very similar to what happened during the McCarthy era. There was a case when I testified in front of the Senate, Sweezy versus New Hampshire. They were looking at somebody teaching about dialectical materialism and so forth. I may not agree with what he was teaching, but he was teaching an idea, in college. What a thought. So I worry that we're going to see, the further application of these types of legal strictures to education. And one of the things that I put in my sonnet testimony from September was an object lesson also from Germany, which was interesting, that they took the definition and applied it. And there were a bunch of Jewish academics and artists and others who were speaking out about what was happening in Gaza. And the definition was used to label them as anti-Semites. And there was a story about it where somebody commented, isn't it ironic that Germany is again deciding effectively what it means to be Jewish? And that's the other thing that's happening here too that's worrisome to me. There's an internal debate in the Jewish community. I'm a Zionist. Israel's important to me, but I recognize I'm a minority, but a significant part, especially of younger Jews, their Judaism leads them to anti-Zionism. They can't justify Israel's existence as a Jewish state, let alone how it's behaving, with their views of what it means to how do you treat the stranger or how do you repair the world. And that's part of the big debate that's going on at the moment. I don't know how the community is going to resolve it. I just don't want Congress to resolve it. I don't want state governments to resolve it. I don't want schools to resolve it that way, but that's what's being asked.
You said you had seen examples when hate had been dealt with well. What were some of those examples?
Oh, lots of times on the campus after October 7th, there were some places where the faculty just said, "Oh my God, we have to model to students how to have respectful disagreements about issues like this," even though, it was a tough time, not only supporting the students, but also Dartmouth, for example, the Jewish studies head and the head of Middle East studies were friends, and they open ask anything you want. Great. At Bard, I had a colleague who's involved in the hate studies efforts who decided, wait a minute, students are throwing around terms like genocide, ethnic cleansing, Zionism, settler colonialism, anti-Semitism, you name it. So we're college. Why don't we have a course? So she put together a course on what these terms mean and why people hear them differently. In my book, The Conflict Over the Conflict, I have a course that I love where it's sort of a simulation course about Israel Palestine, where it looks at the 1930s when the Brits had the mandate for Palestine and sent Lord Peel to go talk to the Jews and the Arabs about what to do. And the simulation course was one where one of the students had to be either a Brit or a Jew or an Arab and faithfully represent what had happened in that commission. I found out about it because there was a Muslim Pakistani student who was involved with the J Street U effort. She was actually president of it for a while. And she had to be David Ben Gurion for 6 or 8 weeks. And the Mufti of Jerusalem was her Israeli classmate. And as much of a pain in the butt as he was, the person on her side, who was the Jabotinsky far right figure, was even worse. So, real education, students came into that class saying, gee, now we're going to figure out how Israel Palestine should have been solved. And they come out of it saying 80 some odd years after the Peel Commission why it has. So, there are a bunch of educational things to do in that context. On the larger frame, outside of the campus, one of the things that I see that's distressing to me, and it happens on the campus too, is the idea that if there's speech you don't like, you want it suppressed. The choice is between allowing it and saying everything's okay, or asking instruments of state or otherwise to not let it occur or to punish it when it does occur. And one of the better models for dealing with hateful speech is to organize against it. So to give you one example out of many, you may remember back after the first Trump election in 2016, there was a group that was actually a person and then a group around it who were threatening Jews in Western Montana, a town called Whitefish. And they were talking about doing an armed march, bringing up a bunch of skinheads on Martin Luther King Day in 2017. And rather than saying, that they can't march because they could, they had a First Amendment right, what we did is we organized ways for people to donate or at least pledge to donate funds tied to how long this supposed march would last. So it gave a disincentive for the people to march. The money would go to things that they detested, like hate crime education, police forces, anti-bias education in the schools, security for the people they were threatening. They would be raising for their worst nightmares. And it gave people in the outside world something concrete to do other than put a like on Facebook, and it gave people in the community a sense that others cared about them. So there are a whole bunch of ways to respond creatively to speech without walking into that paradigm of either we allow a carte blanche or we ask government to suppress it.
It seems that we're in this sort of moment where it almost feels fashionable for the anti-intellectualism, lack of critical thinking. And I've even seen it, I've seen incidents of it in the real world, a kind of a mean-spiritedness right now. And whatever protocols might have been in place have been unleashed. There is, hate is acceptable. I'm going to make a generalization. It's a terrible thing to say, but it feels like we're in a moment where you can say anything, there's no consequences. It's a breeding ground. And so what happened to critical thinking? What happened to sense of kindness, compassion? Like, where are we right now in this moment? Feels like we're trending in a terrible direction.
Yeah, I agree, and I think it's happening on all sides. I mean, part of this is we've always sort of defaulted to these simplistic answers of people that for whom we fundamentally disagreed. There are things that are driving people more into that sort of binary thinking. I mean, cable news is premised on the idea that there are problems in society, but it's a simple problem and it's their fault. And each is monetizing its own audience, certainly social media and so forth. So we're seeing that. We're also seeing some of the people in progressive communities that have been talking about ideas. And I have this in my book about, trigger warnings and safe spaces and microaggressions. And not that that's entirely insane. I mean, you want to treat people well. You don't want to necessarily harm anybody. Words can be hurtful and so forth, but it's become, again, a temptation to put complicated things into something simple. So it's saying, thou shalt not say this, which means, pretty much thou shalt not think this.
Yeah.
And rather than opening up the space to say, I mean, one of the things I say on campuses is your job here is to sort of figure out about life, is to figure out about thinking. It's not to be right. You should be able to be wrong. As a matter of fact, that's a good thing to recalibrate what you're thinking. And schools should be encouraging that, right? So when I teach on my anti-Semitism course, and I know it's always a hot button issue to look at issues of Israel and Zionism and so forth, and this even way before October 7th, what I say to students is the only way to really get a bad grade in my class is to parrot back to me what you think I think. I want to hear what you think. And you'll probably do better if you disagree with me. You have to have evidence for it.
Right.
But you wanna encourage that type of thinking. But I see too much on both the right and the left trying to get people to walk into lockstep with ideas. I see reflections of McCarthyist thinking on certainly on the right, what we're seeing now in terms of we're gonna deport student, an 18-year-old who probably doesn't know which river to the sea they're talking about, but chanting a slogan, and, that to me is nuts. And on the left, I understand why people are upset with things with Israel. And I think people have a right to have their political associations as they wish. But when you get to the point where you see somebody who's a supporter of Israel's right to exist as so anathema, you can't let them into your climate change club. You can't let them into their group. Sexual survivors was another one. That to me is somewhat problematic. You can make the argument at that point they become more of a anti-Zionist group first and a climate change group second. But that's part of what we're seeing. It's noble to have these views that are so certain and so simple and around symbols that people that disagree with you are not only wrong, but potentially evil. And part of the job in an academic institution and a liberal arts education is to get people to see how people have a different point of view and where they might reasonably be. I mean, what I say to students when I talk about Israel-Palestine is I could be wrong, but the chances are that none of you is going to solve it. But you do have the ability of how do you treat people in your community. And I said, even if you are a passionate advocate on one side or another, don't you have an obligation to understand the other side's argument as if you were part of them? I said, when I used to be a criminal defense lawyer, it would have been malpractice for me to go in front of a jury with a client if I didn't think through how I would have approached the case as a prosecutor. Well, you too will be a better advocate if you understand what makes the other side tick, as opposed to just say it's disgusting and write it off, let alone not treat people well. So those are the types of things that I think are helpful.
It just takes a tremendous amount of effort. It's hard work. Jesse and I years ago interviewed a young man who identified as a white supremacist. Do you remember Jesse Frank?
Sure.
It was for a project that we were doing, and then went to prison, and then his cellmate was an older Black man who literally became almost like a father, uncle figure to him, and he had this awakening, but they had spent a long time together, and there was real conversation, and this guy then came out of prison and is a real advocate for human rights and anti-white supremacy. I mean, he does a lot. He's an activist, right? But they were forced to be together. That's a one-on-one, and that's a lot of work. My question to you all is, in your institute, for example, do you have examples of instances of things where it's working, where we're actually breaking down the barriers and we're repurposing this hate? It's energy. So what can we do with it, and what is working?
Yeah, that's a great question. And there are other examples too of people that have come out of hate groups, and there are groups that help people and families of people that have been in hate groups and so forth. But there's a thing called contact theory from social psychologists. And I think there's certainly some level of truth to it. When I look at my own background, I grew up on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. I went to a public school that was 90 something percent Black and Puerto Rican. Those were my friends. And when I went to Brooklyn to go to 6th grade when I was 11, that's the first time I even saw something that there was something like racism. What is this? I was confused by it. So I think we can't all have that wonderful experience that I had, but I think it informs a lot of what I do. And there's a study called the Robbers Cave experiment from the 1950s, which is pretty fascinating, that some 12-year-old boys who were like peas in a pod, intact families, white, middle class, Christian, all went to a summer camp, but it was actually two summer camps. And once they got exposed to the fact that another group was there, they started acting like hoodlums. And this is actually a study in prejudice. And what got them to change somewhat at the end was, despite all the animosity, they had to have a common work to solve a problem. I think it was the water tank broke or something. So there was a superordinate goal that pulled them together. And so I've always been sort of fascinated by that. So one of the things that we're thinking about trying to get some funding to work on with a group that actually already sends high school students basically to different parts of the country to get experiences with other groups, and with the National Conflict Resolution Center, is to see if we can come up with a pilot project with the idea of mixing and matching kids, a Black kid from inner city LA and a Jewish kid from New York and a Hispanic kid from Houston or something, and send them to the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation to work with Habitat for Humanity, but do it structured in a way that people experience people from different backgrounds, do it together, helping somebody else and seeing if that can actually reduce some level of prejudice. Just having that type of experience, it may be something to replicate further. So we're looking into that precisely for that reason. Whether the premise is right or wrong, I don't know, but it's certainly worth looking into.
When you're going to do something like that, where do you start?
You start by talking to social psychologists who know this stuff just to see whether we can put together, what's the critical number? How do we design it? I'm pleased that there's already a group that's sending high school students so we don't have to figure out that aspect. But, just again, to figure out the step by step, because if you're going to invest in doing the pilot, you want it to be able to have results that people can't say, well, the sample is too small, the design was wrong. And then if it's good, then, you can push. At least this is the time this I was thinking about this during the prior administration when the national strategy came out. This would fit into what AmeriCorps was doing, other types of work. Who knows what the federal government and state government's gonna look like after we finish the study, but I hope there are vehicles to make it more unremarkable and normal and part of our lives if it in fact does work.
Are you optimistic for the future?
I'm always optimistic for the long term. I mean, we're in challenging times at the moment. I think. I think we've been in challenging times before. My wife is retired. I tell her I'm never going to retire, partly because I'm never going to finish eradicating hate, but partly because I enjoy the type of work that I'm doing. And I have a non-retirement project, was reading a biography of every single president. And it's really interesting to read history that way because we've had other challenges, right? So certainly the leading up to the Civil War, and there were lots of other times where it seemed really dire, and we've been able to come out of it. So that gives me hope that we've been able to do that before. But what it takes, obviously, is people to care about each other, to care about democratic institutions, to voice things that they think are important. And I think that as long as we can focus on how to deal with the challenges of the moment to come out the other side. I mean, it's almost like I refer back to my criminal defense lawyer hat. My job was not necessarily to get somebody acquitted, it was to get them to the other side of the system with as least flesh taken off of them as possible. We have to get to the end of whatever this period is with democracy as intact as possible.
Yeah.
Do you have anything for people that are watching this that, are going to feel like, what can I as an individual do? What can I do to counter all of this hate that we feel right now? What can people do at the moment that's actually useful?
Yeah, it's a great question. One is, listen, I think a lot of people that I've been talking to are just sort of exhausted and want to sort of crawl into a shell. I sort of understand that temptation. I think that's not necessarily where I would go. I think it's important to keep eyes on all this. I mean, one of the things that, to my wife's great consternation, this way before this current election, I said I had to watch a lot of Fox News and Newsmax. It's not what I usually agree with, but how can I not okay, there are millions of people who see the world this way. How can I not look at that way? So, not to shut yourself off from other points of view. You don't have to agree with them, but at least open yourself up to the fact that those views are there, they're being expressed, and then think about how you think about them. Also, don't think that there's just one magic bullet for how we're gonna deal with challenges like this. One of my concerns about the push of the IHRA definition, it's being used as the Swiss Army knife for, all types of anti-Semitism and how we're gonna deal with it, regardless whether it's in education or other places. Just like a number of years ago, people were talking about Holocaust education. Holocaust education is important. I serve on a committee at the Holocaust Museum. It's not the panacea to every type of challenge about anti-Semitism. So the other thing I would say is don't look for simple solutions to complicated problems and don't get seduced by when people are trying to sell you this is the cure-all magic medicine for it. What I can say is our strength of democratic institutions are important. So support groups, even when you may disagree with them on particular things. I think what the groups like the ACLU are doing are important. I think the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, although I don't always agree with them, I mostly agree with them. But I think that what they're trying to push is the importance of free speech and not using law to go after people and getting fired, whatever, for different points of view. So find those and find things in your community. One of the things that I'll always cherish from teaching, in 2016, I was teaching when Trump was first elected, class on anti-Semitism. And I had a student who was not the best student, not the best writer by any means. And she was an incredible Hillary supporter. So she was missing a lot of classes. I said to her at one point, you can't miss anymore. You really can't. She did. And then the week after the election, she came into my office and closed the door and said, "You know what really bothers me?" She said, "How some of my classmates are treating the Trump supporting women in the mailroom." She got it. She understood. 'Cause we started talking about anti-Semitism. How do you understand anti-Semitism? First, you have to understand how hate and us them works before you can really talk about anti-Semitism. She understood that these were other human beings. I can't imagine anybody at Bard who disagreed with those mailroom workers more than she did, but she didn't go down the path of dismissing them or let alone vilifying them. And I think that's an important thing. Engage in your local communities with people. You may have different points of views on things, but your community is important and not to feed into the binary. Find ways you can agree on things you can work on.